For as long as I can really remember, I have been a nerd. From the random things that I got sucked into as a kid, all the way to whatever I now consciously pick up as an adult, the vast majority of all of my hobbies have been nerdy on some level. And perhaps one of the most grueling ones, the most unattainably difficult to actually get good at, and requiring just a vast amount of different skills, is indie game development.
And I also love it to death.
Having put that bold statement out into the world, I have never actually made a finished game. What I have, to back it up, is a couple of finished hobby projects that simply riff on the idea of game development. I've made a bunch of adventure maps for Minecraft. I ran an ARG for Dark Souls PvP server all the way a couple of years back. And I also have a closet full of not exactly games, not necessarily just prototypes, some things that never really saw the light of day. What I am about to show you is a foray into the latest addition to that closet, brought back to life through my unholy communion with the demonic powers that be. This is my little platformer engine. It has no name, it has no story to speak of, and I really quite like it. So what I'm about to subject you to is the story of how I made it and what I'm doing with it right now. Side note. Technically speaking, this is not an engine. Unity is the engine, but this also isn't a game yet either. This is a vague something that is stuck in between, an exploration of ideas that may or may not really crystallize into something more. So, with English lacking a short common word for this, I will simply continue calling this an engine. This thing is built in Unity, because writing an actual engine from zero with a big boy language with stuff like memory management scares me to bits. And I also work with Java in my day-to-day life for food and shelter, so I am well prepared to handle whatever OOP garbage I am definitely going to conjure up with C#. I also believe that you can, and indeed you should, just make stuff with whatever tools are available to you, and that searching for the perfect combination of tools without actually ever really making things with them is largely a pointless endeavor. The real beginning of this project goes all the way back to winter 2021, when I had written the backbone for it in a state that I can only reasonably describe to you as coffee and winter-induced state of creative frenzy. Then I had promptly abandoned this thing in favor of me obtaining money and knowledge. I came back to it a couple of times throughout the years, but it was always a sort of a short romance before hopping on to something else. And being on another similar wave right now, I decided that I want to tell other people about it. To do that, however, I need to remember how I went from a fresh Unity project to whatever this right now is. Unfortunately, my detail-oriented memory is rivaled by most of God's creations, as well as a sizable chunk of Mushroom Kingdom. Fortunately, the whole project is in Git, and I have a tendency to write half-decent commit messages, so retracing what I did will not be too difficult. Viewer warning. I am but a mortal man, so a lot of this is made in the keep bashing stuff together until it finally starts working kind of style. Or, as I would like to call it, proper engineering.
There's a weird fucking stray cat outside.
So the very first idea that popped into my head was, I want to make a platformer. That, admittedly, is not much to go off of, but it is enough to start. So let's boot up Unity and slap some very basic things together. And there we go. The player character can do all of your basic platformer things. We can move around, we can jump, and there are platforms. Technically speaking, MVP is achieved. Granted, our pixelated actor would feel closer at home in Tetris than anywhere else, but hey, this is a start. So, the focus for now is to keep building stuff and get some more mechanics in before we actually start bike shedding ourselves into oblivion. We will figure out the polishing and the details later, once we can actually separate the metaphorical babies worth keeping from those worth throwing out with the bathwater. To make our poor man's idea of an idea into a slightly better idea, let's talk about some inspirations. As many of my fellow young adults, I cherish the gifts of the modern age, and quite high on the list of things I love is Prince of Persia. Not the movies, nor the original 2D games, but the Sands of Time. Having played it a couple of years after its release, I can still vividly remember just how incredibly cool it felt to play as the titular prince. You were doing sick flips, you were turning all of the enemies into dust, occasionally you were also diving headfirst into a bottomless pit, only for the prince to go, "Sorry, really messed this bit of the story out, let me back it up for a sec," before you were able to restart the game. It must have presumably taken quite a lot of work to come up with a way to evolve the originally 2D platforming into 3D with the success that they had. But now, for me specifically, the question becomes, how can I take some of those ideas and transfer them back into 2D? I came up with two movement mechanics, wall climbing and wall running. These are, essentially, the prince's vertical and horizontal wall runs that are now split between the background wall and the terrain with colliders in 2D. The 3D space that those games operate in mean that there is no such thing as a background wall for them. But in 2D, we do need to deal with the distinction. By the way, I really hope that you like programmer art, because this is gonna stick around for a while, so you better get used to it. The way the wall climb works at this stage is pretty straightforward. If the player is next to a wall that they can climb, as long as they press that input in the direction of the wall, they'll stick to it and begin to slowly slide down. They can climb up once, or with the way it currently looks, they can yank themselves up by the invisible hand of the Lord, and then they have to disengage before they can climb again. As you will see a little bit later, I have ended up shoveling this mechanic into the back pocket, so there's no real reason to explore it further over here. The wall run mechanic is a little bit more involved. Press the jump button when you're over these grey blocks, and that same invisible hand of the Lord will pull you across for as long as those blocks continue. The implementation is quite simple though. We check if the player is touching a background object with the right tag, which we internally store in this flag over here, and then wait for the jumping input to initiate the sequence. The sequence itself is just an infinite velocity modifier, which goes on for as long as we're touching the wall. Player's gravity gets disabled, the velocity is applied, and then we continuously modify it. Also, as you can probably see, while this code is not yet a steaming unmaintainable pile of stuff, it does definitely whisper of its desire to become that. So that was about the point when I started to think about how I wanted to handle player state a bit better than just via endless boolean flags. And I came up with a relatively simple enum solution that ties very nicely into something that I wanted to try for the first time with this project. The way that I handled animations in my previous Unity project was by using its default animation state editor, which meant having to work with this window. This thing, in my experience, has nasty property. It has a goddamn fucking event horizon, which, if you cross it, will overpower reasonable effort at tidiness that you may exert, and ultimately leads you into singularity, where your animation graph looks less like baby's first UML diagram and more like a plate of carbonara. So, I set out to find a solution which would allow me to, in the best traditions of the country that I call home, resolve this problem. After the easiest Google search in the history of Google searches, I figured out that you can just invoke a game object's animations directly via code. This is perfect for us, since I don't really plan to mess around with animation blending in this project. We will be rolling with pure sprite sheets. This also played really nicely into the idea of player state that I had just mentioned, which, inside my own head, I defined as what the player character is actively doing at any given moment. This is mostly related to movement right now, so the player character could be running, they could be idle, they could be falling, jumping, etc, you get the point. But the idea is, right now, that the state has a one-to-one mapping to the animations that I want the player to have. This will change later on as we get a little bit more involved. find novel and engaging ways of shooting our kneecaps off, but we can keep the system flexible if we let arbitrary code resolve the animations we'll want to play. So, we got some movement mechanics in place. The player now keeps state instead of hauling an enormous sack of booleans around, and there is promise of an animation system that's not going to try to strangle itself in its own guts. Honestly, that makes for a pretty decent foundation for a platformer prototype that we're building here. But still, let me really stress it. This stuff is rough. Remember how I said that the spirit of this was just to keep building stuff on top of existing stuff until there's a reasonable amount of meat in our carcass, and only then to begin to peel off the fat? That doesn't mean that we do no polishing at all. So let's do a little bit of that. The movement mechanic of our player character is kind of wacky. More specifically, our jumping is not really satisfying to use, and the worst offender on the list of things that make it so is that it feels like the game occasionally eats some inputs. Now, that isn't what is actually happening. If we add some debug info, we will see that they are being registered and acted upon perfectly well. What's happening is we are bumping into the fact that we, as humans, are kinda slow at image processing. And even with lots of practice, it's still really tough for people to do frame-perfect actions. And that is exactly what our game is currently expecting. So, for a game to feel responsive, we need to allow for some leeway in how we process players' inputs. In case you are interested in more details, smarter people than I have already made videos on the hows and the whys, so I'll just link those in the description. A good practical example of how to improve the feeling of our jumping is implementing coyote time, a small grace period that allows the character to jump after walking off of a ledge, even though we are no longer technically grounded. So let's add that into our game. The implementation is very simple once the grounding system is in place, which it already has to be in place, otherwise we wouldn't be able to implement jumping. Since we have a state system for the player, we can just have a little timer keep track of the time since our player has last left the ground. If that timer is smaller than our predefined grace period, then we allow the player to do a jump. Then it is as simple as plugging the new flag into a regular jump condition. A sister problem to I pressed the jump button too late and am now approaching the bottom of Tartarus at terminal velocity is I pressed the jump button a bit too early before landing and now I didn't jump. The solution is equally simple. We just buffered the jump input via another timer, so I'll spare you the details of how to actually implement that. With those two things done, we can move on to adding some more responsiveness by tweaking another thing that will always be with us while we play: the camera system.
Grant us eyes.
Cameras can be tricky. They are a lot like a good interface. If they are done well, you don't notice them at all. So let's start with looking at how some games, primarily modern ones, handle them. We are going to be looking at three main inspirations over here: Hollow Knight, Blasphemous, and Super Metroid. Here is what we can immediately see. The character is not perfectly centered on the screen. The camera's center is actually a point in front of the player, which is allowing you to see a little bit more of what's in front of you while you play. This is commonly referred to as the look ahead feature and is something that we definitely want to add. Game rooms and areas have invisible boundaries which the viewport cannot get out of. Moreover, the boundaries are not tied to the physical boundaries of the world. See how Hollow Knight hides this tiny little area over here by not allowing the camera to go past the wall until you, the player, actively try to do so? That's what I'm talking about. We want to be able to have boundaries, and we also don't want to really tie them to the physical space. Lastly, certain places in the game world have special camera handling. The camera can either zoom out to cover a larger area, or it might float out to a special viewport to focus your attention on something. I could, and will probably have to, add some ad hoc logic to support those kinds of places, but just even thinking about this ability to focus the player's attention on something did give me an inspiration for a generic point of interest system, which we will talk about last. Starting with the look ahead, the implementation is fairly simple. We are just gonna move the camera's center to somewhere that's a little bit in front of the player. But because we want to be able to move the camera smoothly, we're not gonna be directly modifying its position. Rather, each game tick we will recalculate the desired position and then just interpolate between the camera's current position and that desired target. With that in place, the problem of boundaries, the second feature that we have talked about, becomes just a problem of setting correct target position for the camera. One thing that I quite like in Unity's designer is the collider editor. It lets you interactively resize 2D colliders very easily, and it is also a good enough choice for how to represent arbitrary rectangular boundaries, especially because Unity actually makes it really simple to pull out set boundaries from the collider objects. So, this is what we are going to do. And with that, we just need to clamp the values and set the correct X and Y targets. I also wanted to handle the case where a boundary box is smaller than the camera's viewport. A simple solution for that is just to find the center between the bounds and target that instead. Doing this independently for both axes meant that we can have long, narrow rooms should we want to. I end up fiddling around with the system a bit more, but those experiments are not necessarily worth showing. It was me mainly just gently beating some jank out of the system and adding some small bits and bobbles like screen shake and the ability for the player to look up and down. And finally, the points of interest. These are actual invisible points in the game world with circle colliders attached to them. Once the camera touches one, the point is added to the dynamic list of attractive points and is considered when the camera's target position is calculated for that frame. If a point becomes out of reach, either because it is too far away or because we unloaded it altogether, we simply just remove it from that list. The calculation itself is just looping over the points, figuring out how far they are, and shifting the camera's current target position towards them. The intensity of the shift is inversely proportional to the distance. The further away the point, the less its attraction. As any self-respecting developer, I of course fumbled this logic up a couple of times and probably had a small crisis of fate as I was implementing it. But, the end result works quite well. So take this as just another reminder to trust the process and that the middle of it typically sucks the most. Some time passed between this and the next bit. I had played around with some more movement ideas, as I felt that those climbable walls we implemented at the very beginning weren't really doing it for me. So in the end, I replaced them with simple climbable ledges, which you could hang on indefinitely and jump off of as well, which felt a lot nicer and more polished as a general mechanic. Also, at some point, I had decided that I wanted something a bit more involved for the character sprites, as I was getting really tired of this 1985 Soviet Tetris kind of thing just jumping around everywhere. Enter this pale, fleshy little blob thing, which will keep us company for quite a while. I had also introduced a more complex grabbable object into the movement mechanics: pendulums. These work exactly how you'd expect them to. You grab the ring, and then you can swing yourself back and forth to gain momentum, up to a certain point. After a lot of fumbling, 18 commits versus the 62 commits for the entire previous bit of development, I, for the life of me, just could not figure out a satisfying way of making them work. So eventually, I sadly abandoned them, leaving the things in a just functional state. This, to my pleasant surprise, hasn't gotten borked up by any of the work I had done on the project since. The pendulums still work on the latest build, and I honestly kind of feel like there is something to them. Perhaps they just need a slightly different take on inertia, and they're gonna feel right at home. Editor Tim here from the future. A little side note that didn't make it into the original script, but I still think is worth mentioning. There is a sort of philosophical balancing act that I'm currently thinking about involved in these movement mechanics. Right now, a lot of the movements in the game are built around interacting with the environment. The ledges, the columns, these pendulums, etc. This means that the players are ultimately limited by what the environment allows them to do. An inversion of that would be to allow the character itself more options for movement, which could be done in any kind of terrain. Those are your dashes and double jumps that are typically present in a lot of the platformers. Right now, honestly, I'm not really sure what the good balance between the two is, and should there be another video that I make on this project, this is a good candidate for a topic for that one. Back to the original script now. Having given myself the good old time to think and ponder, I came to a realization. While it is great that you can now jump, hang onto precariously invisible ledges, and swing your lightly fried fish fillet body on rings, all the while having a dynamic camera system that follows you, it really doesn't quite feel the same without the danger of misstepping and getting impaled on a bunch of sharp, inanimate objects. What our prototype is quite ready for is a damage system. Enter the damage system and its first-rate citizen, a little tile that hurts you. There really isn't much to talk about over here. If the player touches one of these tiles, it hurts them, fades the screen, and teleports the player back to the last safe space where they could stand. The last safe space is meant for something like bottomless pits rather than just regular damage. That is something that gets updated a little bit later on as I add actual enemies who deal contact damage. The last safe space is tracked with the help of me throwing around just a whole bunch of invisible trigger objects, each with a single predefined respawn point. This is a bit more manual than having a separate system to figure out where the last safe grounded place was automatically, but it is also really easy to implement. So we are going with that for the time being, with a pinky promise to revisit it if it becomes a bit too pain in the ass to maintain. Which, having the power of hindsight in my grasp, it definitely approaches that threshold, though perhaps not quite crosses it yet. Also, check out how our test level has grown. With different things being implemented, it had to grow to accommodate all of the little playtesting that was happening, and it would continue to grow until we eventually start running into performance issues trying to fit the whole thing into memory. So, before that happens, let's get this solved. A straightforward solution offered to us by Metroidvanias is to split the world into rooms. And you know what? I love me a straightforward solution, because this lets me find my own creative, personal ways of shotgunning half my food off. So let's go and workshop this system. The basic idea is that a single scene in Unity will be a single in-game room. The in-game room will contain all of the necessary game geometry, the objects, the enemies, etc. What it won't contain are the player and any other helper objects that hold the game's state. Those will be preserved in between room loads. To load a room, you have to enter it. You can get into a room via doors, though we don't necessarily want to be forced to only use doors, we still want to keep the ability to warp into rooms open. And doors are just a passage going off screen, which triggers the unloading of the current room and the loading of another one. A single room may have many doors, so we want a way to reference them. There is zero reason to complicate this. Each door gets slapped with an integer ID that is unique within that single room. To keep things somewhat understandable, I decided that the indexing should be consistent. So, the door's indexes start from 0 and get incremented in a counterclockwise direction. In the future, we might want to try to automate this, but this works for now, so we're keeping it. We have just gained a lot of power in this tiny virtual world that I use to live out my deepest, darkest desire of playing God. We can no longer be bound by the confines of what is immediately loaded into memory, which, for the purposes that I'm imagining for this little engine prototype thing, means that we can have a practically infinite amount of rooms. A neat side effect of having doors reference the room-door pairs is that we can have many entrance doors point to a single exit door, or have doors loop into the same room from many different places. This code also isn't dependent on the player interacting with doors specifically, which means that we can have items or something else be the trigger for a room change, which gives us a simple way to implement items like homeward bones from Dark Souls. As a tiny side note, I have also added the concept of areas to rooms. Each room basically has a marker telling the game which overarching zone of the world that room belongs to. It's not immediately useful, but there are a couple of usages that I can see for the future. An easy way to paint different areas with a different color on a minimap, zone global color grading, or some other special logic. Up next, a blitz round of minor improvements that are too small to actually talk about in detail. Players' jump height scales with how long they hold the jump button. Camera doesn't bug out when going in between rooms. You get stunned for a little while if you fall down too far. I wanted some sort of a punishment for not being careful when dropping down, but having it actively hurt you felt a bit too tough. The ledge grab works better. And there are now columns you can climb. Another thing that is inspired by Prince of Persia, which also had climbable columns. This is a solution to the somewhat abstract problem that I've been thinking about for a little while. How do you actually provide an ability for the player to move vertically that isn't just jumping or double jumping? Previously, that void was filled by wall climbing, but we have replaced that with ledges, and upon some playtesting it didn't really feel like keeping both was the right call. As with pretty much everything else so far, the column grabbing logic is fairly straightforward. For a column grab to be possible, the player has to be next to a column. For obvious reasons, I should hope. They simultaneously have to be in the air. This is necessary so you could walk through columns if you were on the ground, and you wouldn't grab onto them if you didn't want to. Lastly, you also have to be actively holding the correct direction key and not be grabbing a column at the same time. Having successfully grabbed a column, we just need to process the new state, disable gravity, and force the player's horizontal position to align with the columns. Then, if the player climbs up or down, just don't let them go above or below where the column actually ends. A small bit that really helped sell the feeling that you were holding on to something a bit slippery was adding a little dampening to the player's velocity as they hit the column, making you slide a little bit in the direction you were traveling. And as you can see, our player's prize got a little bit of an update. This marked the beginning of my side explorations for some aesthetics for the game that might eventually pop out of this little prototype engine, which, as you clearly saw, wasn't a priority up until now. This will shortly manifest itself into a couple of mockups and some work being spent on sprites and tiles, but for right now, it meant that our lightly fried Bean Boy got upgraded to a heavily fried Bean Boy. Also, I added a cute little animation for when you get too close to a cliff, making our little black Bean Boy waddle around anxiously. This is directly inspired by the original Sonic games all the way back from the 90s, and it does touch up on one of the things that I really love to see in certain games. This feature has no mechanical effect on the gameplay. It does not affect how you jump, does not affect how you move, doesn't really change anything. But it does add that little bit of character to the protagonist. Maybe our little Bean Boy is small and generally afraid of the world it finds itself in. Maybe a different protagonist would behave entirely differently when standing right next to a cliff. Maybe some would curiously look down and see what they can find over there, or some would just theatrically display that they don't really care. For the next bit, I ask for audience participation. I need you, my dear viewer, to close your eyes and imagine you are a tiny, adorable creature stuck in a huge and unfamiliar world. What is your first inclination? If you responded with
Complete dominion over the environment,
sprinkled with some
thinly veiled genocide of the local fauna,
then you and I are on the same track. We are about to add some
violence,
to this prototype. So, how do we get there? We first need an attack, for which I had decided to go with this simple Hollow Knight-esque directional melee slash, because I currently have no better idea about what I'd like the combat to be. These slashes are simply prefabs that we instantiate whenever necessary as a child of our player game object, which has the added benefit of automatically keeping our slash moving along with our player and also changing its direction from left to right depending on where we are actually looking. Then, we just slap a cooldown on being able to create slash, and that's about it. There is one slightly special case here, which is the downward slashes. They have this can bounce player flag, which is there to allow us to pogo jump. Straight up, the mechanic that is ported from Hollow Knight. Not sure if it will remain here forever, but it is a fun mechanic, so it's gonna stay for a little while longer. Now that our lightly fried Beaten Boy can actually hit things, we need things to, well, actually hit. This is implemented through the Hurtable class, which our slash can interact with. It specifies just a generic take damage method, which does some simple logic to keep track of the HP, and then we have a couple of these virtual methods to latch other logic onto this. Enemy Hurtable, which is a direct descendant of the Hurtable class, does just that by adding an additional straightforward knockback effect. And, as a side effect of having this particular system in place, we also get destructible environment props for essentially free. Having yoinked some sprites from the mockups I drew at some point while trying to figure out the direction I wanted to take this engine game prototype thing, the privilege of being the very first enemy goes to this thing, which is aptly named Floater. And, well, it floats around just as much as you would expect. More specifically, it floats in a diagonal until it hits an obstacle, at which point it changes directions. Trust me, for how simple those rules are, it took me an embarrassing amount of time to actually get them right. And even then, I still found a small issue as I was cleaning the code up just recently. But eventually, I ironed most of the things out, and here's what we got. Soon after, I had also made a slightly bigger test level and added another enemy with a truly magnificent sprite work to go with it. Just look at it for a second. Isn't he beautiful? There's a problem that arises quite naturally from the fact that our level is made up of rooms, which are each an individual scene that gets loaded and unloaded at runtime. The rooms contain enemies, which we can now kill, but if we leave and re-enter the room, the enemies come back. Somewhere in the deep recesses of my hard noggin, I have had an inclination to implement a Dark Souls-style checkpoint system, in which the enemies respawn only after you rest. And, well, the current behavior is an issue. Looking ahead, we will also need a system to keep track of the global game state for saving players' progress when they exit the game. So, here's the solution that I came up with. Everything in the game has some sort of state attached to it. The state contains things that we would want to persist, and things that we don't. Whether the enemy is dead or alive, for example, is a thing that we want to preserve in between loading the rooms, while its current position within the room is something we don't really care about. So, actually, we only really need to keep track of a relatively small amount of information. This can be done with a flat key value dictionary, linking enemies to their persistent state. So, each enemy needs a unique ID that we can use as the key. There are basically two qualities that this ID must have. First, it must be constant between runtimes, so that we can use them for a save system. We need to be able to save some information, shut the game down completely, load it up, and then have that information mapped to the correct enemies. Second, it must be easy to generate. I honestly just can't be asked to keep track of all of them manually. UUID version 4 actually works great for this. We only care that we can reference certain objects, we don't really care how the ID looks, nor whether they come in a sequence, nor really about its memory footprint, within reason. Here is an implementation that I had absolutely shamelessly yanked from as far I can dig up this guy. The reason for having a custom implementation is that, to my surprise, Unity doesn't actually offer any built-in solutions for persistent IDs. The UUIDs that Unity assigns to game objects are not persistent across reloads, so they aren't really useful to us. Having these IDs in our codebase, now we just need a place to use them. And that simple key value dictionary that is globally accessible will do just fine for now. Now, once an enemy dies, they will write an entry with the kill flag set to true to that dictionary. And then, once we reload the room, the freshly recreated instance of the same enemy will first read the data from that store, see that it should have already been killed, and just silently delete itself from the scene before we ever see it. Since that point in development, I had also implemented a rudimentary lever mechanism, which also uses this store to send signals. But that is a story for another time. Last thing on the agenda is
Style.
your peepers have been witnessing ugly dev textures for a while now. Let me just stifle your excitement right here, right from the start. That is not going to be changing anytime soon. I have, however, been playing around with potential art styles for a game that would be built on top of this engine. These images are, at best, preliminary explorations. I have not committed to any particular art direction or style yet, nor have I really decided that this should really be something other than just a prototype. From the more recent explorations, there is also a whole bunch of rough sketches that have been drawn at some point during one of my vacations. What I did want to commit to was a full playable test level, which would be a bit larger than just a couple of rooms, and would allow me to test and develop some more involved mechanics, like some more movement tech, checkpoints, secrets, possibly some collectibles or upgrade materials, and a small rooster of enemies to go along with it. And, of course, a boss. Here is a sketched out map from a slightly earlier part of development, which was now put to good use as the base for that new level. There are still more things to talk about, but this script is getting just unnervingly long for what was supposed to be a fun, tiny little side thing to document my hobby project. So, here's another blitz showcase of stuff that got added until the current state of the engine. Neighbor-aware rule tile script that was communized off of the internet for more involved tile maps, as well as a bunch of playing around with tile maps in general. I am 99% certain that I will use tile maps for collisions, but I am kind of on the fence about the visual aspect, so no real point in discussing them further over here. Breakable walls, which aren't really much more than a destructible object script applied to a wall with a collision box. Hooray for modularity. Secret rooms which are not visible until you are physically inside of them. A simple currency system with enemy drops. And a dash mechanic, the mainstay of any platformer controls. I also did a bunch of bug fixing and just general cleanup across the codebase recently, which was mostly done so that I would remember what the hell this project even was. And with that, we have caught up to the current state of the project. So, where do we go from here? I am actually not sure. As I was doing the cleanups, a whole bunch of missing functionality popped up that I would still like this engine prototype thing to have. There is, for example, no pause menu, there are no settings, there is no way to save or load the game, death isn't a thing yet really. Calling the GUI that we currently have functional is practically the definition of stretching it. The combat system also requires quite a lot more work if this engine will keep steering towards the traditional 2D platformers, akin to those that I've already referenced in the video. There are currently exactly 2 enemies in the game, one of which looks like a cross between a sleep paralysis demon and baby's first venture into creative arts. And there are the aforementioned checkpoints, levers, things to be unlocked by said levers, collectibles, secrets. I would kinda like to play around with an NPC system as well. Lots of things that can still be done. Despite the fact that there is a lot of stuff that can still be done, I don't really have a clear roadmap of what and when will be added, so the development will continue sporadically for the time being. Right now, the project sits at a bit over 2,500 lines of C# code, which is very manageable in size. Like, let me just stress that out. That is not a large project, that is very, very small. And I don't think I've mangled it up in any horrendous way so far. though it's certainly not the paragon of programming, like this is not the best kind of code you could ever find, it's pretty alright, which is certainly encouraging. I also don't know if or when there will be a follow-up to this video. However, I will continue working on this little thing for the foreseeable future, and we'll try to record an update once we get some more interesting stuff implemented into the prototype. Doing this video has been a lot of fun, and I certainly hope that it has been as fun to watch as it was to make. So, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I will see you again soon. Brought back to life through... I'm stumbling, I'm fumbling, I'm grumbling. Something that is going to be called wall climbing and wall running. Ooh, these are really crackly. That felt good, hell yeah. Still not it. No, this is another one of those cursed paragraphs. God damn. What was I thinking when I was writing this? Whoo, baby. So, we got some movement mechanics in place. The player now keeps state instead of hauling just an enormous sack of booleans around. It wasn't enormous. Who wrote this? It was you, sir. Fuck. That is kind of like a stupid... This is a non-paragraph. In the history of all paragraphs, if there is a paragraph left in the world, this is not it. If there are 2 paragraphs left in the world, this is not it. If there are no paragraphs in the world, this paragraph should be dead. Ooh. Having yoinked some sprites. Like, for example, dimming the carrier. The camera area.